let's talk about your personal experience. I know this is a very tender moment because we're asking you to share something publicly that may be something very private to you, but in whatever way you feel comfortable doing so, it'd probably be helpful for people watching this just to get a sense of some of the experiences that you have had as a person of color in your life.
Well, I think I shared earlier some of the things that have occurred to me, but I think one thing I wish I could share is just a sense of I had a talk with another pastor. I was going to a non-denominational church, and it was predominantly white, and we had a discussion about assimilation. And it was a big ministry. He got up and preached something about assimilation. So me and him ended up talking at the door, and I just said, well, you're saying that God told you to send out 50 pastors instead of, plant 50 of these churches here in Atlanta. That's your calling, that's your mission, that's your ministry, that's your vision. But this is a chocolate city, and you haven't raised up one black pastor. And there's black people here. And he's
By
like,
chocolate, you mean black. I'm just
yeah. No, thank you.
People.
Thank you, Clay. Thank you, Clay. Thank you.
Just helping out the people.
Help them out.
That's right.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Pastor Clay helping y'all out.
Yeah.
And so he just said to me, he said, well, God told me that I'm going to do middle-class white men. That's who I'm supposed to raise up. And we disagreed because he's like, we're not going to have gospel up in here. We're not going to. I said, I'm not asking for gospel. Then he actually told me that he didn't see me as black because he was colorblind.
Yes.
And I said, well, I assure you I am black. I assure you that I come with a whole history of people behind me, ethnic background, culture. And I guess what I would like to say is if people would understand, we always, as black people, have to be on. And you're saying, well, Bernice, what does that mean? I'm going to tell you. What it means is I can't get away with not being above and beyond the job that I'm supposed to do because of the stereotypes of lazy, or you're not as smart, or you're not as. So I'm on at work. I'm on at church if it's not a black church. I have to be on in order to make people comfortable. I had to be on in his church so that he would feel comfortable because I wasn't too black.
Yeah.
So that for me was, we agreed to disagree. I still continue to go to church there. But that for me, I think is a huge thing that I don't think a lot of Caucasian people understand about other ethnicities. And it's not just, not just the black people sitting here. I have talked to people that aren't black, that are people of color in this church, and they have said either you feel like a guest or you feel like you have to be on, and if you're not on, you're not accepted.
Exactly.
Others, any experiences that you'd like to share?
Yeah, when I was in grad school, I work in the field of housing and residence life, and so as part of our responsibilities, we're on call. And so at crazy hours of the night, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, we get phone calls to go and address situations. So one night, I got a phone call and said that there was a young lady who was very sick. She was vomiting, and at the same time, she was being unruly. And she was saying some very harsh things to the black staff member that was assisting her. And so she called me in to go and offer support. And so I went and did my duty to check on the young lady. And she continued to be belligerent. And she said, and there was 2 of us, she said, you're just a bunch of N-words. You're just a bunch of N-words. And she kept repeating it over and over again. As we were there in the middle of the night, trying to assist her and to keep her from basically choking on her own vomit. And so it was just, it was a very hurtful experience in the moment because I'm here giving my best to assist you, but at the end of the day, I was nothing but an N-word to you.
Most of my experiences have probably been shopping. And I don't, it just has. And particularly, there was a store here in East Cobb. I don't think it's open anymore. And I went to the store, and I walked in, and no one greeted me. And I thought, nah, no big deal. Maybe they're just having an off day. And so I looked around the store, and I left. And so I said, well, let me try this again. So I went back another day, and I walked in, and nobody said, hello, how are you? May I help you? And the lady came in behind me, and somebody, greeted her. And I thought, Okay, that's twice. All right. Maybe it's an off day. So I left, came back maybe a month later, and I brought my daughter with me. And we go in the store, and nobody says anything, no greeting, may we help you or anything. And then another mom and her daughter came in behind us. Hey, how are you? Good in. And my daughter caught it. And she said, Mom, they didn't say anything to us when we came in the store. And I said, nope, they didn't. I said, this is the third or fourth time this has happened. And she said, what do we do? I said, we walk with our feet. We leave the store and we decide not to purchase anything from them ever again. We just won't shop here. If you're not going to welcome me when I come to the store, I'm not going to shop there.
Yeah.
And so that's what we decided to do. And some people would say, oh, you're making more of it. No, I did an experiment to see if I was just crazy. And, you know, you go 3 or 4 times and you get the same response. You know you are not welcome in that particular establishment.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
don't go back.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a variation that, I mean, it happened to me when I was in college, but some variation of it has occurred to me all throughout my life. I was in a 90-person dorm at Stanford University, and of those 90 people, there were only 3 of us who were people of color. One of them was Susan Rice, National Security Advisor, myself, and the other actually became the DA of Atlanta, Assistant DA of Atlanta. But there were just the 3 of us. And the gentleman from Atlanta was a smaller gentleman. You won't expect it by looking at me now, but I was a pretty fit athlete in college. And I know that in that dorm, you had a seating area or a living room type area that you could go through to get to the laundry area. And without thinking, I would leave my dorm room, take my laundry to that laundry area, come back. And we had residence life meetings I think it was every week. And in this week, a young lady stood up, and I'll never forget her name, her first name. Her name was Laura, and she was from upstate New York. And she stood up and she said, I'd like to propose that when Kirk walks through, that he announce himself, because when he doesn't, he's scaring those of us who don't expect him. Which was curious to me because you know my name and you know I live here, so why aren't you expecting me? But nonetheless, what really hurt was there were people, other young ladies who raised their hand and said, yeah, I second that, because I was making them uncomfortable when I walked through that area without announcing myself, hey, this is Kirk Patterson, I'm coming through, no need to be alarmed.
Do they want all men to announce themselves?
No, they just said Kirk. Once again, I was the only African-American male. And unfortunately, there were other males who said, yeah, that sounds reasonable. And I remember my roommate, Jim Anderson, who was from Bedford, Indiana, which is basically Kentucky, muttered under his breath, this is BS. I got up and I went to my room and I immediately called my father. And my father said, wait a minute, we pay tuition just like everybody else does. And little did I know that after I had left, my friend, Susan Rice, stood up and said, that's ridiculous. You know who he lives here, and this is as much his living space as yours. And finally, the RA finally came to his senses, came in and asked me to get off the phone and come back into the meeting. My father was prepared to drive the 400 miles from LA to the Bay Area to set them straight. I walked back in and they apologized. But what I remember is that variation of that theme has happened all my life, where there are people who feel as though they can identify what space I'm allowed in. Mm-hmm. And if I violate that allowance of being in a certain space, then they feel perfectly legitimate to call authorities and or ask that I leave for no other reason. And I think that's where, as a person of color walking through this lived experience in the United States, that you cannot be bitter and resentful, because that's ignorance on parade, but it happens. And the one thing that I can't allow is for my witness as a follower of Christ to react the same way that others might react who don't know Christ.
Yeah.
But it is something that my son has experienced, not so much my daughters, but my son has experienced, and it can be enraging. And it's something that we have to, as Movita said, you have to guard your heart, because otherwise you could fall into that resentment ditch and think that everyone feels that way. But also, as Movita said, what really hurt were there were other people in that room who wouldn't have called themselves racist, but they weren't anti-racist, and they didn't stand up to Laura until finally someone else, Susan, stood up and said, this is wrong, and only then did they see the light and apologize.
Yeah.
But it didn't stop it from happening.
And the reality is, all of you have multiple examples that you could recall. And I imagine on a video like this, you probably don't want to share some of the real deep, dark ones that you would only share with a few trusted friends. But maybe it's just worth saying that for a lot of people, issues of discrimination or racism, that's an issue. But
Thank
this
you.
is an experience
Thank you.
Yeah.
that many of you have experienced.
Yep.
And maybe just the power of acknowledging that those experiences do happen is at least part of the way that we get to having a more fruitful discussion.
And I'd like to say something to that. I shared this story in Sunday school about, they gave me some time to talk about my experience as a black woman in America, and I shared the story about my high school experience. And I went out with another sister later on, a couple of weeks later, to drink coffee. And I think the thing that I want to make sure we hear here is, and I just said, I wasn't heard, because she looked at me and she said, I'm not sure why this is such a big deal, because I'm a white woman that has, sexist things that occur to me on my job. I'm discriminated against too, so why are you having this gut-wrenching, as you're saying, experience? And I'm quite sure there's other people that are going to say the same thing she said, listening to this, is, well, what's the big deal? I've been discriminated. I've got ageism. I got this. I've got that. The problem is that, as I've said, it is the pain of what we've lived, but it's also the systemic, overarching weight that won't relent. So I looked at her and I said, but I'm a black woman that has to bear the cross of being a woman, and I'm black, and I can't. You see me? You might say you're colorblind, but you see me. You might not see me the way you want to see me, but you do see me. And something about what you see automatically might instinctively make you think, well, what's the problem?
It speaks to the power of empathy
Yes.
and how we need to try to enter into the world of those that we love and care about.